Alright, sorry I had shit to do for that last one. I'm gonna be around a bit more for this one, but I still got shit to do. 6 hours though, enjoy my philosophy writings. I wrote down what I could regarding a bunch of different topics. So, some of it you might agree with, some of it you might not. Be sure to let me know in the comment section.
The Indifferent Canvas, Constructing Meaning in a Finite Universe. The Indifferent Canvas, Constructing Meaning in a Finite Universe. The Indifferent Canvas, Constructing Meaning in a Finite Universe. Preface: Philosophy and the Necessity of Generational Reinterpretation of Knowledge. The Instability of Certainty Across Time. The purpose of this work. Philosophy, Multilingual Dictionary Entry. Word. Philosophy noun. English. Philosophy is the systematic study of the fundamental principles of knowledge, reality, existence, mind, and reason. An intellectual discipline that seeks to understand being and truth through rational inquiry rather than empirical observation alone. Latin. Philosophia, the pursuit of wisdom concerning existence, knowledge, ethics, and the principles underlying reality. French. Philosophie. Étude rationnelle des principes fondamentaux de la réalité, de la connaissance, de la vérité et de l'existence. German. Philosophie systematische Untersuchung der Grundlagen von Sein, Wissen, Wahrheit, Vernunft und Bewusstsein. Spanish. Filosofía estudio racional de los principios fundamentals de la realidad, el conocimiento, la existencia y el pensamiento. Arabic. Arabic text al-falsafa. Arabic text. Chinese simplified. Chinese text jekse. Chinese text.
Oof,
Japanese.
it can't read.
Japanese text Tetsugaku Japanese text.
It can't read
Core
foreign
Oxford
languages.
definition. Philosophy is the disciplined inquiry into the fundamental nature of reality, knowledge, and existence, using reasoned argument to examine questions that extend beyond the limits of empirical science. Historical context. Across civilizations, philosophy has functioned both as a method of reasoning and as a framework for interpreting existence, continuously redefined by each generation as inherited assumptions are questioned, refined, or replaced. Part 1: Reality. What is truth? Objective truth, within the framework of this inquiry, refers to that which exists independently of human cognition, perception, interpretation, or verification, and is not contingent upon the existence of any conscious observer capable of recognizing it. It is that which persists regardless of awareness, belief, or conceptualization, and which remains structurally intact even in the absence of any mind capable of engaging with it. Within this view, existence is fundamentally non-dependent upon humanity. The continuation of reality is not conditioned by human presence, and therefore the extinction of humanity, or any intelligent species, would not constitute an alteration of truth itself, but merely the removal of an interpretive layer from a pre-existing and ongoing system of reality. The world, in this sense, does not require observation to persist, nor does it require validation to maintain its structure. It simply exists, and this existence is indifferent to whether it is known. From this standpoint, objective truth is not derived from observation, but rather precedes observation entirely. Human beings, or any conscious entities, function not as generators of truth but as participants within it, attempting to interpret structures that are already present. Even in scenarios where no conscious being could ever observe a given truth, that truth would still retain its validity, because validity is not defined by accessibility, but by ontological independence. Truth, therefore, is not equivalent to knowledge. Knowledge is a constrained and partial engagement with truth, whereas truth itself remains unaffected by whether such engagement occurs. Mathematics occupies a particularly complex position within this framework, as it cannot be reduced purely to either invention or discovery without loss of explanatory coherence. On one level, mathematics is undeniably a human construct in the sense that its symbolic systems, notational structures, and formal languages are created through cognitive and cultural processes. It is shaped by human attempts to organize experience, quantify reality, and impose structure upon observed patterns. However, simultaneously, mathematical relationships appear to reflect consistent structures that are not dependent on human cognition for their existence. These relationships persist regardless of whether they are formally expressed, suggesting that mathematical formalisms may be discovered insofar as they reveal pre-existing relational structures embedded within reality itself. Thus, mathematics occupies a dual status. It is constructed in form, but discovered in correspondence, arising from the interaction between human interpretive systems and underlying patterns that appear independent of those systems. This duality reinforces the broader claim that truth itself does not depend on recognition. A proposition may be objectively true even in circumstances where no conscious being is capable of verifying, measuring, or even conceiving it. Verification, in this context, is not constitutive of truth, but merely epistemic access to it. The inability to access or confirm a truth does not negate its existence. Rather, it reveals limitations in the epistemological capacity of the observer. Truth is therefore separable from epistemology, existing in a domain that is not constrained by human cognitive reach. Aya's separation also implies that reality itself is not defined by consistency in the sense of static permanence. Instead, reality is characterized by continuous and uninterrupted change. There is no absolute stillness or fixed state within existence. Every moment represents a transition from one configuration to another, and all apparent stability is merely a temporary arrangement within an ongoing process of transformation. Change is not an event occurring within reality, but the fundamental condition of reality itself. In this sense, existence is better understood as process rather than structure, as flow rather than static form. The implication of this is that what is perceived as stable truth may in fact be a momentary snapshot within an otherwise continuously evolving system. Within such a dynamic framework, the classical prohibition against contradiction must be reconsidered. Traditional logical systems often assume that contradictory statements cannot simultaneously hold truth value, as contradiction is treated as a violation of coherent structure. However, this assumption may be insufficient when applied to complex or context-dependent phenomena. It is possible for seemingly contradictory statements to both reflect aspects of truth when the conditions of observation or interpretation differ. The example of light as both wave and particle demonstrates this principle clearly. Under certain experimental conditions, light exhibits behavior consistent with wave-like properties, such as interference patterns in the double-slit experiment, while under other conditions, such as the photoelectric effect, it exhibits discrete particle-like interactions. These descriptions, while classically contradictory, are both valid within their respective contextual frameworks. The contradiction does not negate truth, but reveals that truth may not be singularly expressible within one fixed descriptive model. Instead, truth may manifest differently depending on the interaction between observer, method, and phenomenon, suggesting that reality may be structurally richer than any single logical framework can fully contain. Consequently, contradiction is not necessarily an indicator of falsehood, but may instead indicate the inadequacy of a singular interpretive system. Rather than invalidating truth, contradiction may expose the multi-layered nature of reality, where different frameworks reveal different valid aspects of the same underlying structure. Truth, in this sense, is not eliminated by contradiction, but distributed across contexts of applicability. Scientific truth must therefore be understood as provisional rather than absolute. It represents the most accurate available model of reality at a given point in time, constructed through observation, experimentation, and refinement. However, such models are inherently subject to revision as new data, methods, or interpretive frameworks emerge. Scientific understanding evolves not because reality itself becomes different, but because the representational systems used to describe reality become more refined or more comprehensive. Scientific truth is thus asymptotic in nature. It approaches accuracy without necessarily achieving finality. It is not a fixed endpoint, but an ongoing process of approximation toward a reality that is always more complex than any single model can fully capture. Language, within this system, is not the source of truth but a secondary representational layer imposed upon it. It functions as a symbolic mapping mechanism through which aspects of truth are communicated, structured, and transmitted between conscious entities. However, language is inherently limited by its symbolic nature. It cannot fully encapsulate the totality of what it seeks to describe. Truth exists prior to linguistic expression and remains independent of it, meaning that linguistic systems do not generate truth, but instead attempt to approximate it through structured representation. As such, language should be understood as a tool of translation between reality and cognition rather than as a constituent of reality itself. Finally, even under the hypothetical condition in which reality is structured as a simulation, the existence of objective truth is not negated but merely recontextualized. If reality is simulated, then the governing rules of that simulation constitute objective truth within the system itself. Truth remains defined by consistency, structure, and independence from individual perception, rather than by the ontological base level from which the system originates. Whether reality is fundamental or derived does not alter the existence of truth within it. It only alters the hierarchical framing of that truth. Thus, objective truth remains intact across ontological interpretations, persisting as the structural consistency of whatever system is in operation, regardless of external framing or metaphysical interpretation. Consciousness and the self. Consciousness, within the framework established in this inquiry, is understood as a phenomenon that emerges from a dual relationship between production and reception. It is not strictly reducible to a single mechanism, such as purely physical generation or purely external filtering, but instead occupies an intermediate ontological position in which both processes are involved. Consciousness is therefore not exclusively something that is produced by the brain in a mechanical sense, nor is it entirely something external to the brain that is passively received. Rather, it is a hybrid process in which biological structure and experiential interpretation interact continuously, producing the phenomenon commonly referred to as awareness. Within this framework, the concept of the self becomes significantly more unstable and context-dependent. The sense of identity referred to as I, often treated as a unified and continuous entity, is in fact better understood as a constructed experience formed through memory, perception, and temporal continuity. For many individuals, this construct becomes so deeply embedded that it appears stable and singular. Yet upon closer examination, it is revealed to be heavily dependent on recall, interpretation, and selective emphasis on past states. In this sense, the self can be considered partially illusory when it is interpreted as a fixed object. However, this does not imply non-existence. Rather, it implies that the self is not static. It is a process, not an object, and its apparent stability is an effect of continuity rather than permanence. This becomes especially evident when considering the role of memory. If memory were altered, replaced, or reconstructed, the continuity of identity would be placed into question. However, the determination of whether the resulting consciousness remains the same person depends not on a fixed metaphysical identity, but on the structure of reintegration and continuity. Identity, therefore, is not anchored in unchanging substance, but in the persistence of functional continuity across experience. The question of sameness becomes less absolute and more conditional upon how continuity is defined and preserved. Despite this fluidity, certain persistent tendencies within consciousness can appear to function as stabilizing forces within identity formation. These consistencies may not represent fixed identity, but they do represent recurring patterns that give the impression of continuity across time. What is often interpreted as a stable personality may in fact be a recurring structural tendency within an otherwise constantly changing mental framework. At the same time, consciousness does not appear to reset with each moment of unconsciousness or sleep. Rather, it persists in a continuous form that is only interrupted temporarily and resumes its trajectory upon reactivation. In this view, consciousness is not repeatedly created from nothing, but rather maintained as an ongoing process that continues across interruptions. The only definitive termination of this continuity, as understood here, occurs at death, which represents the final cessation of the biological system that sustains consciousness. Within this framework, death is not a transformation of consciousness, but its termination. The degree of control that consciousness exerts over itself is also significant within this system. Awareness is not purely passive. It contains within it mechanisms of regulation, modulation, and intentional redirection. The ability to relax, for example, demonstrates a form of internal control over cognitive and sensory states. By altering focus, attention, and physiological response, consciousness can modulate its own intensity and structure. This indicates that awareness is not merely something that happens to an individual, but something that can be influenced, shaped, and directed from within the system itself. However, despite this degree of control, consciousness remains fundamentally isolated. Each instance of consciousness exists as a discrete and self-contained system that cannot be directly merged with another. While communication between conscious beings is possible, and experiences may be described, interpreted, or empathized with, the internal subjective state of one consciousness cannot be fully transferred or shared with another. Each consciousness remains structurally unique, bound to its own experiential framework, and incapable of direct unification with others. This isolation reinforces the importance of experiential divergence in identity formation. If a body identical in structure were to exist but possess different experiences, the resulting consciousness would not be equivalent to the original. Experience is therefore not a superficial addition to identity, but a constitutive element of it. Consciousness is shaped by what it undergoes, and therefore cannot be separated from the sequence of events that produce its interpretive structure. In addition to this, consciousness is fully dependent upon the physical brain. There is no indication within this framework that consciousness exists independently of its biological substrate. Instead, it arises from and is sustained by the physical processes of the brain. The dependency is structural rather than incidental. Without the brain, consciousness does not persist. This establishes a direct ontological relationship between physical matter and subjective experience, in which the latter is contingent upon the former. When referring to the self, then, what is being referenced is not a singular fixed entity but a composite phenomenon. It is simultaneously a thinker, a body, a pattern of recurring cognitive structures, and a continuity of experiential processing. The self is not reducible to any one of these components in isolation, but emerges from their interaction. It is the locus at which thought, perception, memory, and physical embodiment converge into a unified experiential reference point. Thus, consciousness and selfhood are not static objects, but dynamic processes. They are continuously constructed, maintained, and modified through interaction between internal cognition and external experience, existing as ongoing patterns rather than fixed substances. Identity, in this sense, is not what remains unchanged over time, but what persists through change. Extending from this understanding, consciousness can also be examined in terms of its apparent illusion of continuity. While it presents itself as a seamless and uninterrupted stream of awareness, this continuity is not necessarily evidence of a fixed or unchanging essence, but rather the result of overlapping cognitive states that reference one another across time. Each present moment of awareness is partially constructed from the immediate prior state, creating the impression of persistence. In this sense, continuity is not a property of an unbroken self, but a reconstruction performed repeatedly at each moment of awareness. The self does not persist as a singular object traveling through time, but is instead reassembled continuously from memory, perception, and immediate cognition. This reinforces the idea that identity is not anchored in permanence, but in recurrence. What is interpreted as the same person is, in structural terms, a pattern that persists through repetition rather than an entity that remains unchanged. Even deeply embedded preferences, emotional inclinations, and behavioral tendencies, while often perceived as defining traits of identity, are expressions of stable patterns rather than evidence of an immutable core. The consistency of such patterns creates the illusion of a stable self. but this stability exists within a framework of ongoing change rather than in opposition to it. Furthermore, the dependency of consciousness on the physical brain does not diminish the complexity of subjective experience, but rather it within a material foundation that continuously processes and reorganizes information. The emergence of thought, awareness, and introspection from this substrate does not require separation from it in order to retain significance. Instead, it suggests that what is experienced as inner life is the active expression of underlying physical processes that have reached a level of complexity capable of self-reference. Consciousness, in this interpretation, is not an external observer of the brain, but an internal process of the brain observing and modeling itself. Within this self-referential structure, awareness gains the capacity to reflect upon its own states, creating layers of interpretation in which thought becomes both subject and object. This recursive quality gives rise to introspection, self-analysis, and the perception of internal dialogue. However, these layers do not indicate separation from the physical system. Rather, they demonstrate increasing levels of internal complexity within it. The appearance of a thinker behind thought is therefore not evidence of an additional metaphysical entity, but a structural consequence of recursive processing within a unified system. Despite this, the subjective experience of agency remains central to the perception of selfhood. The sense that consciousness can direct itself, choose, or act upon internal states is a defining feature of human experience. This sense of control, while real in its experiential dimension, operates within constraints imposed by the underlying structure of cognition and biology. The ability to redirect attention, regulate emotional response, or alter behavioral intention demonstrates that consciousness is not entirely passive. However, these capacities exist within a bounded system rather than an unrestricted one. Agency, therefore, is real in function but limited in scope, emerging from the interaction between structured processes rather than from absolute independence. Even within these constraints, the experience of selfhood remains coherent because it is organized around continuity of narrative. The mind constructs a story-like structure from memory and perception, linking disparate moments into a unified sequence that appears as a single life. This narrative function is essential to the stability of identity, as it provides coherence across temporal fragmentation. Without such narrative construction, consciousness would not dissolve, but it would lose the interpretive framework that allows it to recognize itself as a continuous entity. Thus, the self can be understood as a layered construct composed of biological processes, recursive cognition, memory integration, and narrative coherence, all interacting to produce the lived experience of identity. It is not a fixed substance, but an emergent phenomenon that persists through structural repetition and interpretive continuity rather than ontological permanence. In this sense, consciousness is not something one possesses, but something one participates in. It is an ongoing process that gives rise to the illusion of ownership, while itself remaining dynamic, distributed, and dependent upon both internal and external conditions. The self, therefore, is not an object within consciousness, but a perspective generated by consciousness upon itself. Time and mortality. Time is among the most universally experienced, yet least understood aspects of existence. Every human life unfolds within it, every memory is stored within it, every civilization is measured through it, and every death ultimately arrives because of it. Despite this constant presence, the true nature of time remains elusive. Humanity has spent millennia constructing calendars, clocks, equations, and theories to measure its passage, yet measuring a phenomenon and understanding it are not the same endeavor. Within the framework of this philosophy, time is understood first and foremost as real. It is not merely a psychological illusion, nor solely a conceptual framework imposed upon change by conscious beings attempting to organize their experiences. Time moves forward. It advances continuously and irreversibly. The present becomes the past, and the future becomes the present, in a progression that cannot be reversed by human will. Whatever uncertainties may exist regarding the deeper structure of reality, the lived experience of existence demonstrates a persistent forward movement that forms the foundation of every conscious life. The reality of time is further reinforced by the reality of the past. The past is not viewed here as a fictional construct generated by memory alone. Memory may distort, reinterpret, exaggerate, or omit details, but distortion does not imply fabrication. The existence of imperfect records does not invalidate the reality of the events those records attempt to describe. A burned city remains a burned city regardless of whether witnesses remember the flames accurately. A childhood remains a childhood regardless of how fragmented the recollection becomes decades later. The past, therefore, possesses a form of reality independent of present recollection. It has occurred. Its events have shaped the current configuration of existence. Every action, every decision, every consequence emerges from preceding conditions. The present is inseparable from the accumulation of all previous moments that led to it. To deny the reality of the past would be to deny the foundations upon which the present stands. In contrast, the future occupies a fundamentally different position. The future does not yet exist. It is not waiting in some completed state to be discovered. It is not a finished destination toward which reality travels. Rather, it is a possibility. It is the domain of potential outcomes that remain unrealized until they occur. This distinction between past and future establishes an asymmetry at the heart of temporal experience. The past contains events that have become actual. The future contains events that may become actual. One is fixed by occurrence, while the other remains undefined until transformed into reality through the progression of time itself. Such a view rejects the notion that all moments exist equally. Instead, existence unfolds continuously. Reality is not a completed book whose pages merely await reading. It is an ongoing process of becoming. Time itself is continuous rather than discrete. It is not understood as a sequence of isolated snapshots stitched together by perception. Human perception may be limited, fragmented, and reconstructed through memory, but these limitations belong to consciousness rather than time itself. Time flows continuously regardless of how it is perceived. This continuity is inseparable from change. Indeed, the distinction between time and change may ultimately be impossible to maintain. Time and change exist in a relationship so fundamental that each becomes difficult to define without reference to the other. Change provides evidence of time, while time provides the framework within which change occurs. A universe entirely devoid of change would render time meaningless. Conversely, change without temporal progression becomes conceptually incoherent. The movement of stars, the decay of matter, the growth of organisms, the erosion of mountains, and the evolution of civilizations all reveal the same underlying reality. Existence is transformation. Nothing remains exactly as it was. Every moment introduces alteration, whether dramatic or imperceptible. This understanding aligns with a broader philosophical commitment that has already emerged throughout this work. Reality is characterized not by permanence, but by continuous transition. Change is not an exception to existence. It is existence. Importantly, the reality of time does not depend upon consciousness. Even in the complete absence of observers, time would continue. Stars would ignite and collapse. Galaxies would collide. Planets would form and be destroyed. Matter would continue its transformations regardless of whether any intelligence existed to witness them. The universe does not require observation in order to proceed. This independence from observation reinforces the distinction between reality and perception. Conscious beings measure time. They do not create it. Yet while time itself may continue independently, the experience of time remains deeply personal. Each conscious being exists within a finite temporal horizon. Every individual occupies a limited segment of existence bounded by birth and death. Within that boundary, time becomes not merely a physical phenomenon, but an existential one. Mortality emerges from this condition. Many philosophical traditions have argued that mortality grants meaning to life. According to such views, death creates urgency, urgency creates value, and value creates meaning. The finite nature of existence is therefore treated as the source of significance. This philosophy rejects that conclusion. Mortality does not create meaning. If existence is inherently meaningless, then mortality cannot magically transform it into something meaningful. The inevitability of death does not generate purpose. It merely establishes a limit. A deadline does not automatically create significance for what occurs before it. Meaning, if it exists at all, must emerge from elsewhere. Death therefore possesses no special power to justify existence. It does not elevate life into cosmic significance. It does not reveal a hidden purpose. It simply marks an ending. For the individual experiencing it, death represents something even more profound, the end of time itself. This statement should not be interpreted cosmologically. The universe may continue. Humanity may continue. Planets may continue to orbit their stars for billions of years, yet none of this continuation possesses relevance to the consciousness that has ceased. From the perspective of the individual, time terminates. There is no future experience beyond the final moment. There is no additional sequence of events to observe. The stream of awareness that once moved through time reaches its conclusion. In this sense, death is not merely an event within time, but the termination of temporal experience. This perspective also helps explain why fear of death is rational. Fear is often dismissed as irrational whenever it concerns unavoidable realities. Yet inevitability and rationality are not opposites. The certainty of an outcome does not remove its significance. Death represents the permanent loss of experience, perception, thought, memory, and possibility. It is therefore entirely rational for conscious beings who value their existence to fear its cessation. Such fear does not require religious belief, supernatural assumptions, or metaphysical speculation. It emerges naturally from self-preservation and the recognition of what death entails. At the same time, rational fear should not be confused with obsession. Acknowledging death as undesirable does not require surrendering life to anxiety about it. The recognition of mortality can coexist with continued participation in existence. Perhaps most revealingly, this philosophy does not regard immortality as inherently meaningless. Many traditions argue that eternal life would eventually destroy purpose through repetition, boredom, or stagnation. Yet such conclusions assume that meaning is tied to limitation. If meaning is instead something created through experience, exploration, relationships, knowledge, and self-directed pursuits, then a longer existence may permit greater opportunities for such creation rather than fewer. Immortality would not solve the problem of meaninglessness. However, it would provide additional time in which meaning could be constructed. The distinction is important. Mortality does not create meaning, and immortality does not guarantee it. Meaning remains separate from both conditions. Time continues forward regardless. The universe remains indifferent. The past remains real. The future remains unrealized. Change remains constant. And every conscious life exists only briefly within this vast and uninterrupted progression. To exist is to move through time. To move through time is to change. To change is to approach an ending. Yet the certainty of that ending neither validates nor invalidates existence. It simply defines one of its boundaries. Beyond the recognition of mortality as a boundary condition of experience, time itself imposes a deeper structural consequence upon all conscious existence: irreversibility. Unlike spatial movement, which can in principle be traversed in multiple directions, temporal movement is unidirectional within lived experience. The past is accessible only through reconstruction, never re-entry. No conscious being can return to a prior state of existence as it was originally experienced. Even repetition of similar conditions does not restore identity to its prior configuration. This irreversibility transforms time from a neutral backdrop into an active constraint upon existence itself, ensuring that all conscious life is defined not only by what it experiences, but by what it permanently loses as it moves forward. Memory, therefore, occupies a critical yet unstable role within this structure. It functions as the only bridge between present consciousness and past existence, yet it is not a perfect transmission of prior states. It is reconstructive rather than preservative, continuously reshaping itself in accordance with present conditions, emotional states, and interpretive frameworks. As such, memory does not grant access to the past as it truly was, but rather produces an evolving model of the past that exists only in the present. This introduces a layered structure in which the past is simultaneously real in its occurrence, yet inaccessible in its original form, creating a tension between ontological permanence and epistemological instability. Within this framework, the human relationship to time is fundamentally asymmetrical. The future is open and indeterminate, the present is immediate and transient, and the past is fixed in occurrence, yet fluid in interpretation.
Transient.
This triadic structure defines the entire experiential condition of conscious beings. The present becomes the only point of direct contact with existence, yet it cannot be isolated from the influence of what has already occurred or what is anticipated to occur. Consciousness is therefore perpetually situated at the intersection of determinacy and indeterminacy, anchored by the past while continuously moving toward an undefined future. This movement toward the future is not guided by inherent purpose within time itself. Time does not contain intention, direction, or moral orientation. It does not progress toward improvement, decline, resolution, or completion. Instead, it advances without preference. Events unfold not because they are directed toward an outcome, but because causality produces successive states of being. Within this indifferent structure, human interpretation often imposes narratives of progress or decline, yet these narratives exist within consciousness rather than within time itself. Mortality, when examined within this indifferent temporal structure, emerges as the ultimate constraint on experiential continuity. It is not merely the cessation of biological function, but the termination of participation within temporal flow. While the universe continues its progression without regard for individual cessation, the conscious perspective that once experienced time is irreversibly extinguished. This creates a unique asymmetry. From the external perspective of reality, death is an event among events. From the internal perspective of consciousness, death is the absolute end of all events. This duality highlights a critical distinction between objective temporal continuity and subjective temporal termination. Objectively, time does not end for the universe. Subjectively, time ends completely for the individual consciousness experiencing death. There is no convergence between these two perspectives, as the cessation of subjective experience cannot be observed or integrated into any continued awareness. It is within this structure that the rationality of fear of death becomes more deeply grounded. Fear is not merely a reaction to physical harm or suffering, but a response to irreversible discontinuity. The cessation of experience is not interpreted as transformation or transition, but as absolute negation of all future possibility. In this sense, fear of death is not rooted in irrational speculation about what follows death, but in the recognition that nothing follows from the subjective standpoint. It is the recognition of finality without remainder. At the same time, the recognition of mortality does not necessarily produce a unified ethical or existential conclusion. Different individuals may interpret the implications of finitude in divergent ways, leading to contrasting orientations toward life. Some may interpret finitude as urgency, others as limitation, and others still as neutral fact devoid of prescriptive consequence. Within this philosophy, however, mortality itself does not carry intrinsic meaning. It does not elevate existence into significance, nor does it diminish existence into insignificance. It simply defines the boundary condition under which conscious life operates. Even immortality, when considered within this framework, does not resolve the structural neutrality of existence. Rather, it alters the duration over which experience unfolds without fundamentally altering the nature of experience itself. An infinite extension of time does not inherently produce meaning, just as a finite span does not inherently negate it. The difference lies not in qualitative transformation of existence, but in quantitative extension of experiential opportunity. Whether this extension would lead to greater meaning depends entirely on the internal structures of consciousness rather than on time itself. In us, do not mortality and potential immortality exist as conditions imposed upon experience rather than sources of meaning within it? Time provides the structure within which consciousness operates, but does not determine the significance of what is experienced within that structure. Meaning, if it arises at all, must emerge from within consciousness acting upon its temporal constraints, not from time itself. Ultimately, time remains indifferent, continuous, and irreversible. Mortality remains certain, final in subjective terms, and structurally defining of conscious existence. Between these two constants, human awareness exists as a transient process, temporarily inhabiting a segment of continuous change, interpreting its passage, and constructing significance within boundaries that neither originate nor terminate within its control. An additional layer emerges when time and mortality are examined in relation to human moral systems, particularly those that are traditionally derived from religious frameworks. Across much of human history, morality has frequently been anchored to religious doctrine, with ethical behavior framed as obedience to divine authority, cosmic order, or metaphysical consequence. Within such systems, morality is often not treated as an independent inquiry into harm, consequence, or coexistence, but rather as a derivative of spiritual alignment or disobedience. This creates an implicit assumption that moral truth is externally assigned rather than internally examined. However, when placed within the framework of time as continuous, indifferent, and non-purpose-driven, the connection between morality and religious structure becomes philosophically unstable. Time itself does not contain moral direction. It does not reward or punish. It does not elevate or condemn. It does not respond to human action with judgment. It proceeds without preference, carrying all events, ethical, unethical, intentional, accidental, through the same irreversible forward motion. In this sense, time is fundamentally non-moral in structure. It does not distinguish between acts of creation and destruction, compassion and cruelty, order and chaos. It simply records succession without valuation. From this perspective, morality cannot logically originate from time itself, nor can it be embedded within the structure of temporal progression. Instead, morality must be understood as a human interpretive construct layered upon a reality that is otherwise indifferent to such categorization. Moral frameworks emerge as systems of behavioral organization designed to regulate interaction within conscious communities, not as inherent properties of existence. They function as stabilizing structures within a transient and continuously changing environment, rather than reflections of an objective moral architecture embedded in reality. Religion, within this context, becomes particularly significant not as a source of moral authority, but as a cultural mechanism through which moral frameworks have historically been transmitted, preserved, and enforced. However, the philosophical issue arises when religious systems are treated as direct validators of moral truth, rather than as interpretive systems developed within specific historical and social conditions. When morality is equated with religious compliance, ethical reasoning becomes dependent on doctrinal authority rather than independent evaluation of harm, consequence, or coexistence within a shared reality. This creates a conceptual displacement in which moral judgment is externalized beyond human reasoning and relocated into metaphysical structures that are not directly accessible to empirical verification or rational consistency. In such cases, morality is no longer examined as a function of lived experience within time, but instead as a set of prescribed rules anchored to transcendent justification. This shifts moral responsibility away from interpretive engagement with reality and toward adherence to inherited frameworks. Yet when time is understood as continuous change without inherent direction or moral structure, such external anchoring becomes philosophically unnecessary for the existence of moral reasoning itself. Moral systems, rather than being derived from transcendent sources, can be understood as emergent structures developed within conscious beings attempting to navigate the consequences of action across time. In this view, morality is not weakened by the absence of divine or metaphysical grounding. Rather, it is relocated into the domain of human responsibility within a temporally bound existence. Within a universe that is indifferent to moral categorization, the function of morality becomes pragmatic rather than absolute. Actions produce consequences within time, and those consequences unfold regardless of moral labeling. Harm, benefit, suffering, cooperation, and destruction all exist as real outcomes within temporal progression, but their existence does not inherently carry moral designation from the structure of reality itself. The assignment of moral value is therefore an interpretive act performed by conscious agents within time, not a property embedded within time. Mortality intensifies this condition. Because individual existence is finite, moral systems become constrained by urgency, uncertainty, and irreversibility. Actions cannot be undone, consequences cannot be fully escaped, and experience cannot be repeated in identical form. Within such constraints, moral reasoning becomes a method of navigating irreversible outcomes rather than conforming to externally imposed absolutes. The finite nature of existence does not provide moral truth, but it does provide the conditions under which moral systems become necessary as tools for managing interaction within shared temporal space. In this sense, morality exists within time but is not authored by it. It exists within mortality but is not defined by death. It exists within human consciousness as a structure imposed upon an indifferent and continuously changing reality. Religion, while historically central to moral formation in many societies, does not function as a necessary foundation for moral reasoning itself. Instead, it represents one of many frameworks through which humans have attempted to stabilize ethical interpretation in response to the uncertainty of existence. Thus, when viewed through the combined lens of time, mortality, and continuous change, morality appears not as an absolute law embedded in reality, but as a constructed system operating within it. It is shaped by the conditions of finitude, constrained by the irreversibility of time, and applied by conscious beings attempting to navigate an indifferent universe in which meaning is not given, but constructed. When examining morality within the framework of time, mortality, and continuous change, a fundamental philosophical tension emerges between moral realism and moral constructivism. Moral realism asserts that moral facts exist independently of human perception, in a manner similar to objective truths about physical reality. Moral constructivism, by contrast, holds that moral systems are generated through conscious agents as functional frameworks for organizing behavior, experience, and consequence. Within the structure of this philosophy as it has developed thus far, morality aligns more closely with constructivist principles, not because moral experience is considered arbitrary or insignificant, but because there is no indication that time itself contains inherent evaluative structure. Time, as previously established, is continuous, irreversible, and indifferent. It does not distinguish between actions in terms of moral value. It carries all events forward without preference, whether those events are constructive, destructive, intentional, or accidental. Within such a system, moral properties cannot be observed as intrinsic features of temporal progression itself. There is no mechanism within time that assigns good or bad to events as they occur. Instead, moral categorization arises only when conscious beings interpret events within the context of their own experience, survival, memory, and interaction. This leads to the conclusion that morality is not embedded in reality, but constructed within it. However, constructed does not imply illusory or insignificant. Rather, it indicates that morality is an emergent interpretive system developed by conscious agents navigating the consequences of action across irreversible time. Because actions unfold within a continuous causal chain, their effects propagate forward regardless of intention, and this propagation necessitates frameworks for prediction, regulation, and evaluation. Morality, therefore, functions as a stabilizing structure within temporal uncertainty rather than a reflection of an external moral law embedded in existence. Within this structure, the question of suffering becomes particularly significant. Suffering is not defined here as a moral category in itself, but as a phenomenological and biological reality experienced by conscious beings. It is an outcome of certain conditions within time, not a metaphysical principle. The question of whether suffering possesses objective moral weight depends entirely on whether moral realism is assumed. Within a constructivist framework consistent with an indifferent and non-evaluative reality, suffering does not carry intrinsic moral designation imposed by the structure of the universe. However, this does not diminish its reality or its impact. Suffering is real in experience, real in consequence, and real in its influence on behavior, cognition, and survival. What is absent is not its reality, but its inherent moral labeling within the fabric of existence itself. This distinction is crucial. To say that suffering lacks intrinsic moral weight is not to say it lacks significance. It is to say that its significance is not pre-written into reality as an objective moral fact. Instead, its significance emerges within conscious systems that are capable of experiencing it, interpreting it, and responding to it. Thus, suffering becomes a central factor in the construction of moral systems precisely because of its experiential intensity, not because of any externally imposed ethical property. From this perspective, morality becomes a system designed to manage the consequences of suffering, cooperation, harm, and survival within a temporally constrained existence. It is shaped by the need to navigate irreversible outcomes in a world where actions cannot be undone and where time only moves forward. Moral reasoning, therefore, becomes an adaptive structure rather than a discovery of pre-existing ethical laws. This recontextualization of morality also directly impacts the concept of responsibility. In an indifferent universe, responsibility cannot be understood as alignment with cosmic moral order, because no such order is evident within the structure of time itself. Instead, responsibility becomes a relational and causal concept grounded in the capacity of conscious agents to influence outcomes within temporal flow. To be responsible is not to conform to metaphysical judgment, but to occupy a position within causality where actions produce effects that persist beyond the initiating moment. Indifference of reality does not eliminate responsibility. Rather, it removes the illusion of external moral enforcement. In the absence of cosmic judgment, responsibility becomes entirely internal to the system of conscious interaction. It is defined by the capacity to act, the ability to anticipate consequences, and the inevitability that actions will propagate through time. In this sense, responsibility is not granted by the universe, but generated by participation within it. This produces a shift in how moral weight is understood. Instead of deriving significance from external moral realism, significance is derived from relational consequences within time. The forward-moving, irreversible nature of temporal existence ensures that every action contributes to a chain of effects that cannot be fully undone. Responsibility, therefore, emerges as an acknowledgement of this structural reality rather than as adherence to externally imposed ethical absolutes. Under this interpretation, morality is neither diminished nor elevated by the absence of inherent cosmic valuation. It is repositioned. It becomes a framework through which conscious beings navigate an indifferent, continuously changing environment in which actions have real consequences, but not predetermined moral classifications. Meaning, value, and ethical judgment arise within consciousness as interpretive acts applied to a reality that itself does not assign such labels. Thus, within the unified structure of time and mortality, morality exists as a human-generated system of interpretation operating inside a non-moral, continuously unfolding reality. It is shaped by suffering, constrained by irreversibility, and expressed through responsibility, but it is not authored by time itself. Time carries all events equally forward. Consciousness alone differentiates them. With the structures of objective truth, consciousness, time, and morality established, the inquiry reaches its final foundational layer, meaning itself. If truth describes what exists, consciousness describes how it is experienced, and time describes how it unfolds, then meaning concerns the interpretation imposed upon existence as a whole. This final section determines whether interpretation reflects something intrinsic to reality, or whether it is entirely constructed within the constraints of conscious perception operating in an indifferent universe. Section 5, Meaning and Meaninglessness. Within this philosophical framework, meaning is not treated as an inherent feature of reality, but as a construct entirely generated by conscious beings. Meaning does not exist as an independent property embedded within existence itself. Instead, it is produced through interpretation, cognition, and subjective assignment of value to experiences, events, and outcomes. In this sense, meaning is not discovered within reality, but constructed within consciousness as a response to reality. This construction of meaning does not imply falsity in the sense of logical error, but rather highlights its origin as a cognitive fabrication rather than an ontological constant. Meaning, therefore, does not exist independently of the minds that generate it. It is dependent upon consciousness for its formation, and without consciousness, the concept of meaning collapses entirely. In the absence of any conscious observers, there is no framework within which meaning can be assigned, interpreted, or maintained. Thus, meaning is not a universal property of existence, but a conditional phenomenon arising only within cognitive systems capable of interpretation. From this perspective, meaning is not something discovered within reality, but something constructed, though not in a neutral or purely mechanical sense. It is constructed through interpretive layering that can be described as a form of cognitive fabrication, where consciousness imposes structure, significance, and narrative onto otherwise indifferent processes. Reality itself does not contain meaning. Rather, meaning is projected onto reality by conscious agents attempting to organize and navigate experience. Even phenomena that are objectively real within the physical structure of existence, such as material objects, events, or states of being, do not inherently contain meaning. A pebble, for example, exists as a physical object with measurable properties, but any meaning assigned to it exists only within interpretive frameworks imposed by consciousness. The pebble itself is not meaningful. It is simply real. Meaning arises only when interpretation is applied. Within this structure, it becomes possible for something to be completely real while simultaneously being entirely devoid of meaning. Reality and meaning are therefore not equivalent categories. Reality refers to existence independent of interpretation, while meaning refers to interpretive value assigned within consciousness. The two operate on fundamentally different levels, and the existence of one does not necessitate the existence of the other. Suffering, within this framework, also does not contain inherent meaning. It is a real phenomenon experienced within consciousness, but it does not carry intrinsic significance imposed by the structure of reality itself. Any meaning attributed to suffering arises only after interpretation, not from within the experience itself. Suffering exists as experience, consequence, and sensation, but not as an inherently meaningful structure within existence. From this position, human life is not inherently meaningful by default. It does not arrive preloaded with purpose, significance, or justification. Instead, any meaning attributed to life must be constructed externally through conscious interpretation. Because meaning is not embedded within existence, it must be created rather than uncovered. This places the burden of meaning entirely within the domain of conscious agency rather than within the structure of reality itself. However, this constructed nature of meaning introduces instability. If meaning is created rather than inherent, it becomes subject to change, contradiction, and dissolution. It requires justification within individual or collective frameworks, and these justifications vary widely across time, culture, and perspective. In many cases, meaning is tied to systems of work, survival, identity, or social structure. Yet these systems themselves are not inherently meaningful. They are frameworks that assign conditional meaning based on participation, utility, or belief. When examined without such frameworks, meaning becomes less stable and more clearly revealed as a constructed overlay upon an indifferent reality. Within this context, the indifference of the universe becomes a defining characteristic. Reality does not assign value, purpose, or direction to existence. It does not distinguish between outcomes as meaningful or meaningless. It does not evaluate events through any moral or existential lens. Instead, it proceeds through continuous change without regard for interpretation. This indifference does not remove meaning from human experience, but it removes any external validation for it. Meaning persists only as long as it is actively constructed within consciousness. It is not reinforced by the structure of reality itself. Impermanence further destabilizes meaning by introducing continuous dissolution of all states, experiences, and conditions. If all things are subject to change and eventual cessation, then any meaning assigned to them is likewise temporary. Meaning does not persist independently of the conditions that generate it. As those conditions change, meaning is altered or erased. In this sense, impermanence undermines the possibility of stable or absolute meaning, since no interpretive structure can remain fixed within a continuously changing system. Within this framework, purpose and meaning are related but distinct concepts. Purpose refers to directed intention or function within a system, often tied to action, goal orientation, or designed outcome. Meaning, by contrast, refers to interpretive significance assigned to existence or experience. While both emerge from conscious systems, they operate differently. Purpose is structural and directional, whereas meaning is interpretive and evaluative. Both are constructed rather than inherent, but they function at different levels of cognition and experience. The conclusion that arises from this structure is that both meaning and meaninglessness are themselves conceptual constructs operating within consciousness. If meaning is constructed, then its absence is also constructed. Even the recognition that existence lacks inherent meaning is itself a product of interpretive cognition applied to reality. However, this recognition does not generate meaning within the system it describes. Rather, it reflects the same condition of constructed interpretation applied to the absence of inherent value. Thus, the final position within this section is not the discovery of meaning, nor the discovery of absolute meaningless, but the recognition that both are interpretive frameworks imposed upon an indifferent and continuously changing reality. Existence itself remains neutral, while meaning exists only as long as conscious beings actively generate it within that neutrality. Building upon this framework, another consequence emerges regarding the relationship between meaning and agency. If meaning is entirely constructed, then agency becomes the mechanism through which construction occurs. Consciousness does not merely observe an absence of inherent meaning. It actively participates in the generation of interpretive structures that temporarily stabilize experience into recognizable patterns. In this sense, agency functions as the operative condition under which meaning becomes possible at all. Without agency, there is no interpretive act, and without interpretation, meaning does not arise in any form. However, even within this generative capacity, agency does not imply permanence or resolution. Any meaning constructed through conscious action remains bound to the same conditions of impermanence that define all other aspects of existence. This introduces a structural instability into all meaning generation processes, where even deliberately constructed significance is subject to erosion over time as conditions shift, perspectives change, and cognitive frameworks evolve. Meaning, once formed, does not exist outside the system that produced it, and therefore cannot remain independent of the temporal processes that continuously alter that system. This leads to a further implication. Meaning is not only constructed, but continuously reconstructed. It does not exist as a fixed object created once and preserved, but as an ongoing process requiring sustained cognitive reinforcement. As consciousness evolves through time, so too do the interpretive frameworks it uses to assign significance. What is considered meaningful at one stage of existence may become non-meaningful at another without any change in external reality itself, indicating that meaning is not anchored in objects or events, but in the internal configuration of the interpreting system. Within this dynamic, there is no stable point at which meaning can be finalized or completed. Every attempt at finalizing meaning encounters the structural reality of change, where both the interpreter and the interpreted are subject to continuous transformation. This makes meaning inherently provisional, not in a weak or uncertain sense, but in a structurally necessary sense grounded in the continuous flow of time and the instability of all cognitive states. Another consequence of this structure is the separation between existential experience and evaluative interpretation. Existence proceeds regardless of whether it is assigned meaning, while meaning exists only within the interpretive layer imposed upon existence. This creates a bifurcation in which lived experience and constructed significance operate in parallel but non-identical domains. One is continuous and indifferent, the other discontinuous and interpretive. The interaction between these domains produces the full texture of human experience, but neither domain depends on the other for its existence. In addition, the absence of inherent meaning does not produce a vacuum in experience, but rather exposes the self-contained nature of interpretive systems. Consciousness does not require external meaning in order to operate. Instead, it generates internal frameworks through which experience is organized and navigated. These frameworks function as adaptive structures rather than absolute truths, allowing consciousness to function within uncertainty without requiring ontological guarantees from reality itself. This also reframes the role of existential recognition. The recognition that meaning is constructed does not terminate meaning generation, nor does it invalidate interpretive systems. Instead, it situates them within their proper domain, as tools rather than truths. Meaning becomes a functional layer rather than a foundational one, operating above the structural indifference of reality without altering that underlying indifference. Within this layered structure, meaning and meaningless cease to operate as mutually exclusive opposites. Instead, they emerge as different interpretive states applied to the same underlying condition of existence. Neither state alters the nature of reality itself. Both exist only within the cognitive frameworks that generate them. This produces a system in which existence remains constant in its indifference, while interpretation fluctuates across different conceptual configurations without ever affecting the foundational structure upon which those configurations are imposed. Ultimately, this establishes a final structural observation. Meaning does not resolve the condition of existence, nor does meaningless negate it. Both remain confined to the interpretive domain, while existence itself persists outside of evaluative categorization. The result is a system in which reality continues uninterrupted, independent of interpretation, while consciousness continuously generates shifting layers of meaning that neither define nor alter the underlying continuity of what exists. When extended to its ultimate implication, the structure of meaninglessness within existence does not remain confined to abstract interpretation, but expands into the recognition that all systems, regardless of complexity, stability, or significance, are ultimately subject to dissolution over time. Every structure that exists within reality, biological, psychological, social, or cosmological, is embedded within the same fundamental condition of impermanence. Nothing that arises within time exists outside of its progression, and therefore nothing that exists within time is exempt from eventual transformation, decay, or cessation. This includes not only individual consciousness, but also the frameworks through which meaning itself is constructed. Languages, cultures, belief systems, identities, civilizations, and even the conceptual models used to understand existence are all temporal formations. They arise, persist for a duration dependent on conditions, and ultimately dissolve or transform into something unrecognizable from their original form. Even the most stable structures are only stable relative to the timescales within which they are observed. When extended beyond those scales, all stability becomes temporary arrangement rather than permanence. Within this context, the eventual cessation of all conscious experience is not an exceptional event, but a structural inevitability embedded within the nature of temporal existence itself. Every individual life, regardless of its content, intensity, or perceived significance, is situated within a finite interval of awareness bounded by emergence and dissolution. No experience escapes this condition, and no consciousness persists indefinitely within the same form. The endpoint of all individual experience is not conditional but necessary within a system defined by continuous change. When extended further, even the broader structures that appear to contain or contextualize life, such as planetary systems, stellar formations, and large-scale cosmic processes, are themselves subject to eventual transformation and collapse across vast temporal scales. The implication of this is not immediate negation of value or experience, but rather the recognition that no structure within reality is exempt from the principle of impermanence. Everything that exists is transitional, regardless of its apparent duration or scale. However, this recognition does not function as a directive toward withdrawal or negation of experience. Instead, it establishes a distinction between permanence and participation. The absence of permanence does not invalidate the reality of experience itself. It only removes the possibility of finality as a stabilizing foundation. Within a system where nothing persists indefinitely, significance cannot be derived from permanence, but this does not eliminate the capacity for engagement within the conditions that do exist. In this sense, the absence of ultimate meaning or enduring permanence does not constitute a justification for disengagement from existence. Rather, it clarifies the nature of existence as something that is not granted, validated, or sustained by external guarantees. Experience occurs regardless of whether it is ultimately permanent, meaningful in an absolute sense, or preserved beyond its own duration. The absence of final justification does not prevent participation within the conditions that are currently present. From this perspective, engagement with life becomes an act occurring within a finite interval rather than a pursuit of permanent validation. The lack of inherent meaning does not negate the reality of experience, nor does it diminish the immediacy of perception, sensation, or action. Instead, it situates all experience within a bounded temporal structure in which value is not externally assigned but internally navigated. Within such a framework, the recognition of eventual cessation becomes not a directive toward abandonment but a clarification of condition. All conscious beings operate within a limited span of time, and within that span, experience unfolds continuously regardless of its perceived meaning or lack thereof. The fact that this span is finite does not alter the fact that it is occurring. Thus, even in the absence of inherent meaning, even in the recognition that all structures dissolve and all consciousness eventually ends, existence remains the only domain in which experience can occur. There is no external position from which life is observed except life itself, and there is no alternative framework in which consciousness operates outside of the conditions that define it. The absence of permanence does not negate participation, it defines its boundary. In this way, meaninglessness does not function as an instruction toward withdrawal from existence, but as a descriptive condition of reality that removes the illusion of permanence without removing the reality of experience. What remains is not justification, but presence. Not permanence, but continuity within finitude. Not external validation, but the simple fact of existing within a system that continues regardless of interpretation. Life, therefore, is not meaningful in any inherent or absolute sense, nor is it rendered void by that absence. It is a finite unfolding within continuous change, experience from within, without guarantee of permanence, but also without cessation of participation until its natural conclusion. Within that structure, the act of living is not justified by meaning, but made possible by existence itself. Part 2: Life. Birth and involuntary existence. Birth, when examined through the lens of involuntary existence, introduces a structural condition that cannot be reconciled with notions of consent or pre-existing agency. Existence does not originate from the individual experiencing it, but is imposed upon them as an initial condition of consciousness. This establishes a fundamental asymmetry at the foundation of life. Awareness emerges without prior agreement, and participation in existence begins without any capacity for refusal. Within this framework, involuntary existence is not interpreted as inherently positive or negative, but as neutral in its structural formation. The act of becoming conscious does not itself contain evaluative weight. Instead, it simply initiates a state of experience that will later be interpreted through lived conditions. Neutrality here does not imply emotional detachment, but rather the absence of intrinsic valuation embedded within the act of birth itself. However, neutrality at the structural level does not erase the lived consequences of involuntary existence. The fact that existence begins without consent introduces a philosophical concern regarding responsibility external to the individual experiencing life. In this context, responsibility is partially displaced toward those who initiate life without adequate consideration of the conditions into which consciousness will be placed. The act of bringing life into existence becomes ethically significant not because existence itself is judged, but because the conditions of entry may or may not reflect sufficient awareness of the burdens, structures, and consequences that follow. At the same time, once existence has begun, the question of consent becomes functionally inaccessible. There is no meaningful return to a pre-existent state from within consciousness itself. The comparison between existence and non-existence becomes conceptually possible but experientially unreachable. While both states can be defined in abstract terms, only one can be inhabited. Non-existence cannot be experienced, evaluated, or recalled by the consciousness that emerges into existence, which creates a structural separation between conceptual comparison and experiential reality. This separation does not eliminate the philosophical validity of comparing existence and non-existence, but it does establish a boundary. Such comparisons remain abstract rather than experiential. Within lived reality, existence becomes the only accessible state, and therefore the only domain in which evaluation can occur. The absence of experiential access to non-existence means that all interpretation must occur from within existence itself, regardless of how existence began. The nature of birth as an initiatory event without benefit-oriented design further reinforces this condition. Existence does not begin with regard for the eventual experience of the individual consciousness that emerges. Instead, it initiates a process of awareness that unfolds independently of whether it produces comfort, suffering, stability, or instability. Benefit is not embedded within the structure of emergence. It is a potential outcome that may or may not arise within the conditions of lived experience. Within this structure, the concept of obligation becomes limited. The only universal responsibility that emerges within this framework is not metaphysical or externally imposed, but behavioral and relational. The requirement to engage with other conscious beings in a manner consistent with minimizing unnecessary harm and maintaining functional coexistence within shared existence. Beyond this, there is no intrinsic obligation owed to the structural system of existence itself. Life does not function as a contract, and existence does not operate as a debt that must be repaid to the conditions that produced it.
All right. Thank you all who tuned in and listened to my philosophy.